Our next speaker is a visionary AI and data leader with over 2 decades of experience at the forefront of artificial intelligence evolution. A member of XPRIZE Brain Trust, he has pioneered high-impact AI solutions across diverse industries, including financial services, healthcare, high-tech, consumer, and retail. Ladies and gentlemen, speaking about breaking the trauma cycle, how indigenous wisdom can nurture compassionate AI, Mr. Ahmer Inam.
Thank you, June, for hosting and organizing such an amazing gathering. Sincerely appreciate it. I think you can see my background and what I've been doing, and I do consider myself to be a technology and an AI optimist. I strongly believe that with the right use of technologies, we can do amazing things. While we continue to talk about the risk of AI in robotics and technologies and impact on our society, we also have to think about how best to leverage these technologies for overall betterment of humanity, right? So where the technologies are working for us and with us instead of getting weaponized against us. So with that, that is essentially the core of my, my belief and ethos when it comes to the technology. So I'll specifically talk about within the AI and compassion side of the things, how we can understand the trauma that exists within current AI. And when we're talking about AI, we're largely talking about large language model, and it kind of hurts me deep inside to refer to only LLM as the AI, because AI is such a massive domain on its own. But let's sticking with that LLM and large language models primarily as AI right now. So from harm inheritance to generative co-flourishing, that is the theme. So next slide, please. Perfect. Trauma embedded in AI. I think let's ground ourselves in what we mean by that when it comes to trauma. Like then the cure of the trauma from a compassion perspective, we'll get into that. How does trauma get embedded in AI? There are 3 high-level modalities. The first one is bias in the training data itself. Where the data is generated from, where it's created, how it's created, a lot of exploitative policies that go into it, and how does the data get annotated and labeled. So a lot of the biases that get perpetuated downstream, post-training, all starts in the grounding itself. So the grounding itself is a massive problem. And what the big tech companies have done is mostly gone after cheapest, lowest commodity data, exploiting people by not paying them much wherever they could get the labor. There are plenty of interviews out there where people are talking about they have no background in cancer, but they were paid $1 an hour to label cancer imaging data. And they feel horrible that some cancer AI is being trained on data that they have absolutely no background in evaluating. The second thing is the real world harm. That comes from all of the systemic biases of human decisions, discrimination, and things like that, that are deeply rooted in the data itself, right? Vast majority of large language models are trained on mostly internet data. About 60% of the corpus comes from Reddit. Who here thinks Reddit is a flourishing environment made up of best of humanity? Right? It's a very toxic environment. And that gets to the trauma echo, right? Epigenetics research shows that human trauma gets embedded deeply into our DNA. And it goes from parent to child, and it takes at least 3 generations of nurturing for that trauma to be removed or at least managed, right? 3 generations of nurturing. We have tremendous amount of human trauma that is deeply embedded into the epigenetics of language models. If we think about the embeddings, as the, or the vector embeddings as the epigenetics of the AI, it's essentially deeply rooted in a lot of human trauma, right? So I gave a talk recently, and then people were like anthropomorphizing AI, essentially AI as a human. And what I said is that AI has been born, it's like a baby stage right now. It's been born with tremendous amount of human trauma deeply embedded in it, and there are two pathways from here. Either we nurture it and through interaction, or we create another AI that is built from the grounding that creates essentially the yin and the yang, the balance to it, right? Nurturing is going to be hard because it's controlled today by a very few, 3 to 5 at most, very large entities, monolithic, centralized, and a lot of control and power, right? So they're not going to give that power away. So that means we have to build an AI that is built with people, for the people, and by the people as a way to essentially counterbalance it. Um, so within that, I think there's one construct we can talk about is the indigenous wisdom itself as a medicine against this trauma. So when we think about the indigenous or hyperlocal wisdom, we're talking about reciprocity, balance, and generational responsibility forming the foundation of healing ethics, right? Too many words. Essentially, what we mean is that indigenous practices are rooted in harmony with land, community, and the spirit, right? For example, Japan's, pardon my accent here, or I'm going to butcher some words, so apologies for that, but Japan's Satoyama system that exemplifies this approach, right? So managing the landscape as shared ecosystem where humans and nature co-flourish through mutual care. This to me means grounding, right? And very specifically, why grounding is so critical here is because so much of what grounds us is getting lost very rapidly. Like, so that preservation and collection is extremely important before a lot of this is completely lost, right? So vanishing knowledge crisis is what we are sitting on right now, which, by the way, is getting accelerated further by these homogeneous monolithic systems out there. So about 14 days, we lose one language from the world. Every 14 days, a language is lost forever, right? 2,500 languages are at risk of disappearing by 2,100. And each language, when we lose it, it comes with complete irreplaceable medicinal, ecological knowledge and cultural wisdom. So for example, Japan's Ainu and Ryukyuan languages are at critical threat of disappearing, and carrying with those languages are millennia of sustainable practices and healing traditions. So I'll quote a few data points to further ground us into the reality of what we are losing. So I mentioned about 14 days is when we lose a language. 43% of all living languages are endangered. 43, almost half of all languages, right? 10% of languages have less than 10 people alive who still represent those. Threatened languages support 86% of all unique medicinal and biological knowledge. So most of the human understanding of biological and medicinal languages are actually, knowledge is in these threatened languages. And this is just for the North America. 73% of all medicinal and biological knowledge lives in just a single language. So that's a huge issue. So if you think of the Northwest Amazon, 645 plant species with medicinal uses across 37 languages. Of those 645, 91% of that knowledge exists in one language with no backup and no redundancies. So once that knowledge is gone, of those 645 plants that are used globally for medicinal purposes, and we're just talking about medicine here, and a plant. We're not talking about the entirety of human knowledge here. That will be gone forever, right? Give you a couple of examples of the impact of these medicines, right, that came from indigenous practices. So ACTs, which are used as the first line of defense against malaria, were practiced around Japan, China, these regions came from plants. According to WHO, 7.6 million lives have been saved with this medicine. 1.5 billion cases have been averted, and today it's almost a $500 million industry. Statins that came from Reddy's rice have created massive scale impact on preventing cardiovascular conditions, right? Almost $20 billion of a medicine just by 2030. Aspirin, 2.6 billion plus industry, and then it comes from old traditions of Native Americans, so Dakotas and Seminoles, right? So the communities who ran the longest running experiments on their own people, how much did they get out of these medicines? Like nothing, right? Economic impact was extracted out and away. And that's happening right now, and it's only accelerating with how the data is collected and large language models are created, right? So, which is why it's extremely important in preservation of this and rooting all of this into the knowledge systems and then training next era of AI, right? Let's talk about, sorry. So the healing framework here a little bit, right? So let's get into a little bit more tactical level here. So the way what we're proposing essentially is to build the new era of AI is to ground it into the healing framework coming from the understanding of indigenous communities. And at the core, it comes with respect, which is the honoring the nature and the culture in the data practices itself. And then the next level is the balance, which is harmonizing human and machine intelligence, right? So embodiment and collaboration and collective ecosystems. And then the top layer essentially is regeneration, which is designing for healing and not harm. The top layer is typically doesn't get talked about much. I'll quote a recent MIT study that came out that from people who are addicted essentially to, or super users of ChatGPT, they are not able to recall. They're losing a lot of our critical thinking, right? So we are moving rapidly into not only losing tremendous amount of knowledge, but we are losing a lot of our critical thinking and curiosity by giving our agency away to the machines. Those who understand the algorithms and how these systems are created are aware that these are essentially the forced perspective. So the perspective that they're trained on, they force that perspective. In fact, any of the system, you can challenge it, and they get angry, right? They don't stay in a position, they get angry. The second thing is that all of these systems are based on a lossy compression, right? So the language itself is a very lossy compression. So if a word only describes itself, and it doesn't describe its meaning, then it's already lost here, right? So to understand all of this, regeneration aspect is extremely critical to where we design the systems to where they enable our critical thinking, not take it away. So it's a complete design paradigm shift to essentially more epistemological approach to interacting with these systems. So epistemological foraging versus giving our faculties away, right? Yeah, a couple of case study, I think, as I mentioned, the Amazonian medicines, the tribal knowledge providing breakthrough in malaria treatment. Maori out of New Zealand is a very good case study around the Maori's AI revitalization. And at least within Japan also, the Ainu cultural renaissance that's happening, which is deeply rooted in indigenous plus the modern ecosystem, right? So actually, before we go into it, I just wanted to also ground us in one more framework, which I don't have a slide here. Going back to the risk, right, and why the next slide is important. So when you think about the entirety of human knowledge, about 90% of human knowledge is what is is represented in what is called the tacit knowledge or the implicit knowledge. So implicit knowledge is essentially representational knowledge that lives within, but through a process, we can represent it any form of data. So any representation that exists as a data layer is called explicit knowledge. And so think of like the explicit knowledge as the bottom, and then the implicit knowledge as the next layer, and then the tacit knowledge, which is the know-how. We somehow know things that are hard to explain and express, but human experts can utilize our tacit knowledge to make critical decisions. And in this loop of internalization and externalization between tacit and implicit knowledge evolves into what is called wisdom, right? And so 90% of that data is all implicit and tacit, less than 10% is explicit. Of that 10%, less than 10% of that is on the internet. So a tenth of a tenth. And what's on the internet, another tenth of that is publicly available and open internet. So anybody good with math can do the math quickly. So a tenth of a tenth of a tenth. And of that number, about 80% has been scraped off to train AI, which about 60% of that is English language, mostly North American, 30% German, and the remaining French, Spanish, and other languages, right? So it's a very shallow and very narrow corpus of knowledge. So the claims that are out there that somehow this extremely shallow and narrow knowledge, if I may even call it knowledge, because a lot of that just junk, right? Bad data. Somehow representation of all of human knowledge and all of human reasoning. The second grounding I would put in out there is human reasoning is an evolutionary process. It's at least a bilateral exchange through which we start with an inquiry, and then through an process, iterative process, almost like a Socratic process, our abductive reasoning evolves out of it, right? So for reasoning to evolve, we need at least two entities to have a dialogue, right? Most internet data is largely a single person perspective or a third person perspective. Perspective doesn't have reasoning in it, right? So the data is shallow, is forced perspective from a very small space context window, and there is no reasoning in it, which is why large language models, which are based mostly on token prediction, struggle with high context, deep problems, right? So especially multidimensional reasoning, plenty of research papers out there that they fail, right? So hallucination then starts to occur. So if hallucination is already so bad of a problem within the context that they train in, imagine the net negative impact of taking these technologies and applying it in parts of the world whose perspective just doesn't even exist in it. So I'll give you a very quick example. Breast cancer risk assessment. There's a framework that was created in the US of about less than 2,000 women. I think the sample may have been 200, mostly upper income white women, and then there was a survey done on them to assess the risk of breast cancer. So I think the framework was called GALE, or Taracusic was another framework. It's a very, anybody understand math or statistics can say this is not a representative sample. So the rubric that was created out of that small sample was institutionalized and now used globally to assess the risk, right? So we did a study just in the US to see what is the misclassification, first among the white women that the sample was from, and it was over 20%. That means 20% in finding in stage 4, when they should be aware about the risk and start to manage it. In US, misclassification among women of color was close to 40%. Outside the US, 60 to 80%. And this is a framework that's used globally. So imagine the data that's feeding today's large language models, the risk of perpetuating, and this is not even bias or anything, this is just completely no context from your culture or anybody's culture and being utilized in making decisions. So an app for breast cancer risk assessment built on this data in a very small community gets published and available through all the Apple stores and everything. And the risk of harm is so high, I mean, even though it's unintentional, right? So, which is why it's so critical in routing all of the AI into, routing it into the localized context. So with that, at least my company, that's what we are trying to do. And I've been on the other side of the AI, happy to chat more later about it with any of the large companies. So essentially what we're doing is building the AI essentially from the ground up for the people, by the people, with hyper-localized context collection and enrichment, reasoning already embedded in, rooted in the local ethos and cultures, and then training it from the ground up. So as I said, there are two ways to fix that trauma, right? One is through trying to nurture what's there, or the other one to create another variation that creates the counterbalance. So it's so that's essentially what we're doing, and our approach to AI is quite different as well. It's not prediction of a token. We're actually specifically looking into how, as humans, we think. So our data that's going into it is how we think and reason, how we sense. So sensing that's where the embodiment comes into play. So human touch, fingers, right? And the third element is then how do we embody, that means brainwave, right? So combination of those three elements coming in. So all the grounding is how we think and do comes from the local perspective, and then collection of those additional things. So that's it's complete embodiment from that aspect. And one quick example I'll give you why we need to also preserve how we act or do or sense is that similar to how we're losing all the languages, we're also losing a lot of our wisdom of doing things with our hands. In fact, our dexterity of our hands is also declining because we are mostly just typing or scrolling, right? So a lot of the fine crafts work that used to happen, we're losing that tradition, but we need to not only protect it from anthropological perspective, but train the future of robotics, because if we need to train a neurosurgeon of tomorrow, like a neurosurgery robot. So it takes about 14 years to train a human to become an expert neurosurgeon. And that's mostly very fine micro dexterity surgical movements. How can we train that for tomorrow if we don't have that? So we can learn from people who do fine embroidery. So basically micro fingertips-based movements, right? And in other such art. So we can collect all of that, rooted in that, and then train the robots of the future. So essentially, yeah, I'll try to finish it up like this event in June, like kind of the launch of this initiative. Japan is a perfect place as a living lab of initializing this approach to building AI, because of Kyoto's heritage of omotenashi, embodiment of deep empathy and anticipatory care, and Osaka's Machizukuri, which is a community-based resilience through collaborative building, and essentially it's a great place to root it into the tradition while also pushing the boundaries into the future. Happy to chat more afterwards, but these are the path forwards on how we are enabling it. So decentralized labs, locally sourced, locally built, training on the wisdom, building reciprocity networks, and then overall compassion-based governance from a policies perspective. And this is one path that we're thinking about. How do we go from extraction to co-flourishing?
Thank you so much. My heart is beating really fast because just the conversations are getting more intense, but it's an exciting time to be alive because of people like you, people like June, all of our speakers and partners and collaborators and organizers today. Such super essential conversation, and I hope next year maybe we can do 1 week of AI compassion. Each speaker gets 1 hour each. I have a lot of notes. Thank you very much.
I'll say AI compassion hackathon. Not just talking, but actually building.
Yeah, thank Thank you very much. Thank you so much.